welcome to this special edition of Quick to Politic. So today, my guest is Randy Wimbley, Fox 2 News reporter, dad, and just all around great journalist. We are going to be speaking with him today about issues that concern, the death of the fifth estate, journalistic integrity, the evolution of, journalism in the digital and social media age. And thank you very much for Randy Wimbley joining us here today. And without further ado, here's our interview. Thank you so much, Randy Wimbley, for joining me today.
No doubt.
And you are a reporter with Fox 2 News. So tell me a little bit more about yourself and your journey to being a journalist and, being media savvy and somebody who is in a front-facing role all the time and having to work in a fast-paced environment. So, because it seems like it can be chaotic, but yet at the same time rewarding.
Yeah, very much so. It can be chaotic, and at times it's more chaotic than rewarding, I suppose. But I'm from the area, born in Detroit, raised in Southfield, graduated from Harrison out in Farmington Hills. And that's where I kind of got the idea while at Harrison to go into TV news. We had somewhat of a role-playing assignment my senior year for a government class, and I had to, I guess, pretend that I was the governor or something. And so I was like at the this little panel they had set up in the classroom and just saying, what we need to do is spur economic development. And I was just joking around. And Mrs. Leach, the teacher, she said, Randy, you do that really well. And I'm thinking, do what? I'm just making a mockery of this assignment is what I'm doing. But I just kind of thought about coupling that, I guess, the theatrics, if you will, with a passion for storytelling and for writing. And I'm not sure how exactly I put the two together and said, maybe I can make an honest living doing TV news. And that was really it. That was really it. And so, yeah.
Okay, so it came out of like something that it wasn't like when you were given, I've always wanted to do this. It was like, wow, I enjoy it. So you kind of stumbled upon something that became, all right, I love this. This is the thing, and
Yeah.
you were encouraged by somebody. So I actually wanted to also ask a question about pretty much like being a part of this every single day. You guys are out there, working hard, and you're on the front lines. How do you decompress, and how do you sort of detach from some of the more traumatic things that happen while reporting?
Yeah, so it just kind of happened naturally. I remember my first full-time job working up in Saginaw, the Saginaw Bay City Flint Market, and I think I was covering a murder up there, and I believe the victim was a kid, if I recall correctly, because that was maybe 12, 13 years ago at this point. And something just sort of clicked because I had covered a few shootings and homicides up until that point, starting out, but something sort of clicked, and I just kind of said unconsciously, I have to detach and sort of compartmentalize to a certain degree, right? What I experience and what I'm covering at work, and when I go home. Now, granted, then I didn't have a wife and 4 kids as I do now, but there was just something of an unconscious sort of acknowledgement that I can't sort of allow myself to be too emotionally tied into what I'm seeing day in and day out, kind of covering just the more tragic stories that we tend to cover. And so, and that can be, I can imagine a bad thing, because if you see that too often, you can get perhaps a bit jaded, and then you compartmentalize to the point where you're sort of very much detached and you lack empathy. You don't really have any compassion. So even though I decided that I needed to compartmentalize some things, I also sort of decided that I can't fully detach and kind of lose my humanity or detach my humanity from what I'm seeing on a fairly regular basis, and just even just my faith being a Christian, uh, I can never really be someone who lacks compassion. And so, in just knowing that at times I just have to put some, just safeguards up, uh, so that, I'm not overwhelmed, or that, one does not become overwhelmed just seeing and covering certain things so often. And so it's somewhat of a balancing act, holding on to that compassion and empathy and everything else, while also um, learning how to put up some guards and to compartmentalize to a certain extent.
Okay, thank you. Because I often wonder, like, I remember watching recently. Jessica Dupnack was downtown covering like one of the early Detroit city protests, and there was some sort of toxic, substance that was thrown, at police and reporters, and she was kind of standing where the police were, and it was just like looking at that whole thing unfurl, and then she's right back at work the next day, and I've seen the same thing where traumatic things are happening and you guys can just go right back to it. I think it's important that you did say your bit there about how you feel like, and sometimes you can lose your sense of humanity, and because you're looking at things and you're trying to not take it home to your family. And 4 kids, oh my gosh, that they must be adorable. um, and yeah, um, I would imagine it's difficult for everyday people to be able to relate to just how tough this job particularly is.
Sure, and I want to be clear. It's not nearly as tough as, say, an ER doctor, or nurses in the emergency department, or firefighters and medics and police officers, who are seeing far worse, far more often. A lot often than I, as a reporter, will ever see what they see and what they experience. So I want to make sure I have that sort of caveat when we kind of talk about this. But at the same time, one, especially talking about like when Dupnack was covering the protests, I covered them quite a bit as well. And when things, would escalate and got a little hairy. And so, one, you're in the moment. You know what I mean? So there's somewhat like, uh, uh,
Yeah, it's like, okay, you have to almost like think on your feet and like, okay, well, what am I going to do next? How do I
bingo.
still keep the integrity of this interview and then let people know what's going on? So,
Exactly.
in some ways, this is one of my other questions about how a lot of people are social media kind of I don't know what the influencers who want to be kind of like social justice warriors who also want to inform people and kind of like using the art of telling the story at the same time of informing people. And I think we're at kind of like a precipice of this is a sort of merged genre that's becoming something that you see a lot of people like TikTok, on TikTok telling stories, and they're the middle of things, and but at the same time, you guys as journalists, have the training, you have, the investigation skills. And so that kind of leads into another question of like, it's two-part question. So how do you merge sort of, that emerging new type of media with, just old school journalistic, just going out and covering events? How much of that social media, presence has to play into what you guys are currently doing? And I think this is going to be a follow-up question, so I'll just let you
Sure.
answer that first part of it, because I think
Okay.
that's a heavy one in itself.
So social media is becoming increasingly important, especially when you talk about engaging our viewers, because they're not just, sitting around waiting for the 11 o'clock news, for the 5 to 6 o'clock news, etc. They're getting the information online, social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. So you want to have a presence there and use it to engage viewers, to inform viewers. And so I think it's in one, being in the news business, right? You want to kind of always drive them back to the actual like newscast or what have you, or the app, or where they can find the story. But trying to inform them, give them a taste of a story, but while also make sure that you're sticking to just those old school journalistic rules and what have you. And it's interesting that you noted it, that we're seeing sort of the rise of the informer influencer, if you will. And it's interesting, some of the conversations that are happening even within like just mainstream old school news industry, like in the news industry and what have you, especially once the national protest began, and someone raising the question about reporters and journalists of color have just sticking to that norm and that rule of being neutral, and how that is, some would argue, and many did argue, and I can't recall the article where they raised this point, how that is often detrimental for journalists of color, because you almost have to give at times credence to the both sides of an issue, so as to avoid appearing biased and what have you. But at the same time, and just to segue from that, or to jump from that to the informer influencer, that rise of that sort of personality in those entities right now in social media, they don't really have the same rules that to abide by that we have to abide by. You know what I mean? And so that doesn't mean that folks in
their approach.
Right. And so, and that doesn't mean that at times folks in the news industry, they don't at times fall short of those standards and rules and ethics of news gathering and news telling and news reporting, right? But you're always striving to stay in that zone, and there's something to sort of hold one accountable. And so I think that's something that people would do well to be mindful of when they talk about just like, the mainstream media and abolish the old gatekeepers, which there's always room for, disruption and innovation and what have you. But at the same, but at the same time, those gatekeepers are there for a reason, right? You think about a gatekeeper, a gate. It's a protect. You know what I mean? When you
it's
there for a reason. Yeah.
I always, like, as a newly elected official, I always emphasize to people, there are policies and procedures, and I know that you may want to demand, and I think maybe I'm a millennial, and I think Gen Z is like, we want change now, but it's like, okay, there are policies, there are procedures. You need to go through a process in order to make things happen. And, the gates are there for a reason, and you set up these structures because, for the most part, things follow certain flows, because it just kind of keeps not only the peace, but it also keeps, order.
Bingo. Exactly. And to that point, the one that I was raising earlier about the gatekeepers and what have you, in the rise of the influencer, informer and what have you, when you remove, so to speak, the gatekeepers of the news industry and in the news industry in general, when that is weakened to such an extent where it doesn't have the sort of influence, if you will, that it had in previous years, I think you'll see slowly but surely a lot more information that is widely proliferated and accepted. You know what I mean? So one of the things that's really on the horizon right now, and we've seen bits of it, things called deep fakes. Are you familiar with that?
Yes. Deep fakes with, you just don't know where the source is coming from, and you can't even really trust it because it does look reputable or real.
Bingo. And so because we are moving to the point where it's common and sort of and I don't want to say it in like a snarky way or anything, but it's somewhat in vogue to distrust everything, so to speak. When you look at something like deep fakes and what have you, and when you scoff at old school things like simple, like fact checking, you know what I mean?
Right.
That I think we're going to be particularly susceptible to a lot of misinformation if we don't sort of slow down a bit, try to return to, okay, is this really true? And so sort of like a microcosm of this conversation, when you talk about deepfakes, it's just so often that misinformation is spread via social media. how people believe poorly constructed memes over actual evidence and experts and so forth and so on. Now, that doesn't mean that experts, they're not to be challenged or they're beyond critique. That's not at all what I'm suggesting. But when we can kind of see that misinformation is so widely accepted, and you know what I mean, and faulty information is
it's taken on its face, for like in the
yeah,
face
exactly.
how you into it, where versus, and that kind of leads into my other question, which is about journalistic integrity. They say that there's this term that's floating around out there and has been for a few years, particularly since the election of the president in 2016. They say that the death of the fourth estate is sort of something that has taken away journalistic integrity. And, it's also taken away that sense of, I was watching a movie, Spotlight, last night about the Boston Globe in 2001, yes, uncovering, just this whole ring of, lies and deceit, that the Catholic Church had perpetrated. And this was journalists going after a story doggedly. And, this is something that it kind of makes you wonder, like, how much of, the job as a television news reporter is journalistic, and what are your thoughts on the death of the fourth estate, and why understanding why you have to keep the integrity and why the gates have to be kept, as opposed to having these informer influencers who kind of come in and just say this is what it is, when really there's no research behind it, there's no facts that have been checked. How do you really keep the fourth estate alive so that there is accountability, so that there is a sense of, okay, well, we are journalists, we are professionals, you can trust us because we are the non-biased, part that is here to keep, not only elected officials accountable, but, to keep the system there, because there's a reason why it's called the fourth estate, because you have your government and then you have, this other factor and they work in tandem to check each other.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I think for one, the fourth estate, it isn't dead. I'm not one to ever believe it's not dead.
I hope not.
It's yeah, exactly, right. It's changing. It's undergoing a lot of change, and withstanding a great deal of change. But the journalistic integrity is crucial, and just even you mentioned Spotlight, and just what the Boston Globe did, what, maybe 15, 20 years ago. I can't remember exactly
almost
when
20
it was
years
said.
ago now.
Okay, 20 years ago.
2001.
Okay, there we go. Okay, yeah. And just like the need to devote more resources towards just more investigative reporting. If a story warrants like deeper probes, to be able to make room for that to happen. But with the change in TV viewing habits, radio listening habits, newspaper readership, right? All of that is sort of shrinking. And the trouble just that the news industry is having is when that shrinks, revenue shrinks, and now there is not that much, resources to go around to invest in some of these things in the way that different news outlets and companies used to invest in them. And so just sort of sticking to just those old school journalistic rules and what have you is crucial. It's crucial because even though the news business is often lambasted, the mainstream media and everything, people still expect, even though they may not trust many news or some news organizations and so forth and so on, people still expect that what they're hearing from the news is true, right? Maybe we can't get to the absolute bottom, right, of a particular issue or a story, but we're going to try to chip away at it and get to it slowly, but we're going to cover this stuff as extensively as we can and do so in a way that hopefully and prayerfully fair, balanced, nuanced, right? And that's something that just the past, decade or two has really been going out of the window just in society in general, right? Nuance. And so it's important just to kind of have all of that there. And so while also recognizing that, you know, in breaking news situations, you have to report what you see, what's there, the atmosphere, you know what I mean? And sort of kind of taking all of that into consideration and just being as astute and diligent and judicious as one can be within the confines of whatever you're covering in the circumstances surrounding it.
Okay, thank you. I really appreciate that because, you know, I think that's something that, you know, people always say like, oh, if it bleeds, it leads, and then you're just going to go after that. And I wonder how much of that is, you know, okay, we're trying to keep up viewership. We're trying to keep up, you know, people watching the you know, because there are 4 different networks here in the Metro Detroit area that are, you know, having, you know, like nightly newscasts, or 3 if I'm not mistaken.
Three.
And, you know, you do have to, you know, find the stories and that balance between entertainment and between shock value and sensationalism, and in between, you know, just kind of making sure that people are, you know, being informed. So that kind of leads me to another question about, you know, we talked about investigative reporting. Infotainment has actually seen a rise. You know, when you talk about people like John Oliver and Hassan Minhaj and Trevor Noah, where these are comedians reporting on the news, and they're giving this sort of humorous take on actual issues, and they're kind of pushing the envelope in new and innovative ways that I think, you know, this is when I was in college, I noticed the rise of things like The Daily Show, where they were really pushing the envelope. And, you know, they were starting movements where, you know, they were calling Congress people and making them be more accountable. And I know that John Oliver and Hassan Minhaj in particular, they do a lot of investigative reporting, and you know, they talk about genocide and injustice that are happening all over the world. And I know recently John Oliver talked about Xinjiang in China, and you know, the Uyghur people, and you know, just some of the injustices there. So what is your take on that as a genre, and maybe it's sort of competing influence over traditional journalism and traditional newscasts as far as information and people?
Right. I think for one, in the grand scheme of things, I think that there's more pros than cons, right? And one of the ways that I kind of think about it is it's sort of the benefits that one has as an outsider, right? When they're tackling or doing something that's not necessarily or wasn't supposed to be their lane, and they can find success, and not just like a superficial success, right? But actual success in doing so, because they're coming in as an outsider and they're not really constrained by all of the rules that those on the inside are accustomed to, so to speak. And I think one of the biggest example I think that we have locally of that, or at least in recent years, is my buddy Charlie LaDuff, the former Fox 2 reporter, right? Now, one, let me just say this first. Charlie is like a heck of a reporter as far as his investigative skills. He's incredibly sharp-minded, a very smart guy. But what made him, because his star really rose once he got to Fox 2, and the reason I think it did, because he was a print guy. He was used to doing some TV, but like in a different sort of category or like a style of it, but not traditional local TV news. So when he came to TV as this print news guy, incredibly smart, gifted, a phenomenal writer, you know what I mean? A good grasp of history. And he was able to come in with his quirks and like just his personality, who he was. He was able to come into TV news not bound by the constraints in the culture, in the mores, so to speak, of TV news. So when he came in and he was doing his stories, it didn't seem like traditional TV news. It wasn't TV news speak. It wasn't the traditional TV news style. And it really hit, right? Because it was just that sort of phenomenon where you have an outsider coming into something new, and they're not bound, you know what I mean, by those constraints that the insiders are bound to.
He already had so much clout from the outside, so there was no, okay, well, you really have to do good and be good at what, you know, we have trained you to be good in. And, you know, he comes in as this outsider who's able to put his own spin in. And I think that's where you kind of talked about disruptive innovation earlier.
Yeah.
You come in as a disruptor because of the fact that you already have, made that sort of name for yourself, and you already have that sort of, clout out there, and people trust you and they trust information coming from you. So the delivery style doesn't so much matter as much as, say, for a newbie or somebody who, worked their way, up in the traditional ways.
Yeah, but I would say that the delivery style, it was incredible for someone like LaDuff, and even when you see like the examples that you first brought up, John Oliver, The Daily Show, it worked because they came in and said, we don't have to do it this way. We don't have to do, you know what I mean? And so take Charlie, when he first started doing these stories, in the way that he did them, along with just the traditional news gathering, news reporting, right? But the way that he did it, it so illustrated the point that he was making so vividly and so clearly and so uniquely that it was phenomenal. It was really, 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 and it made for good TV news, and it wasn't traditional TV news, And so in the same way, you look at John Oliver's, I guess the Samantha Bee would definitely fit that role.
Daily Show alumni, and because they all come from that same school of, we are fake news, and that's the way they used to call themselves before it became something that the president kind of made a misnomer. So this is like a style of, like you were saying, we don't have to play by those rules. We're going to make it something completely different. But then along the way, they became kind of a source for millennials like myself to I'm not watching traditional news. I'm going to go to the John Oliver and get my information. So, I think that's kind of an interesting phenomenon that kind of happened. And so I think last decade and now, we're kind of like, I think the 20s are going to be defined by this evolution of journalism and reporting and how people get their information. So I think one of my last questions I wanted to ask about is, I see myself kind of in that kind of realm with Quick to Politic, which is a social commentary web series and a podcast.
Yeah.
Where I just my goal is to inform people. My goal is to let people know what powers they have, and I feel like there's agency to be had in understanding what kind of power you have. And, you don't wait around for, professionals or politicians to make your reality for you. You go out there and you if it doesn't exist, you create it. So I want to be able to encourage people to, create their own paths by informing them, by getting their thoughts going and wheels turning. And I really like to, ask professionals like yourself, like, how do you make people feel more at ease? When you're interviewing them, and, because I'm looking to improve my style of, just interview, and then also, still stay kind of like true to myself. And, because in some ways, like, doing YouTube videos that just inform people about languages and international affairs, I can be, kind of silly and bubbly, but, at the same time, I do want to kind of have some of that journalistic integrity and, keep that balance. So how do you, as far as interviewing people, what are some strategies and what are some advice that you would give someone who is maybe fresh out of journalism school? Because that was my original major. And then I majored to, foreign policy. So,
nice.
What would be your advice for someone wanting to, make people feel more at ease and improve their interviewing styles?
So let me tackle. I just want to make one last point about the previous question, the rise of the different forms of news reporting and what have you, like the daily shows, etc. I think one of the critiques, if I can offer one without being seen as like a hater or a hack, right? I think one of the critiques, and it's not like I'm trying to be overly critical, but that some would make is that it either, and I guess they would make this critique of any news organization nowadays, that it leans either too far left or it leans too far right. So Waters' World would be another example on Fox News. may not be as rigorous as far as investigative stuff like The Daily Show, right? But somewhat sort of in that lane with it's comedic, it's humorous, etc. But it leans way right, right? The critique on the John Oliver is that it perhaps leans too
It's
left.
left.
Yeah, it leans too left, and so I think the next wave will be to a certain extent. I think we may be seeing the rise of it with some other outlets, perhaps. It's just something that's a bit more balanced, right? It doesn't take shots at just the liberals. It doesn't take shots at just conservatives, but it strives to be as
centrist and
as
moderate.
centrist, as moderate, or as not so much neutral, but it strives to be as balanced as possible. It strives to be balanced as possible, and that leading to your other question, what can folks sort of getting into it, I guess, keep in mind, or that would help them. My thing is your passions, right? And you talked a bit before about bias, and here's the thing: everyone has bias. So this notion and it wasn't just a notion back in the day, because from what I understand, there were some very old school reporters and journals and what have you. Some of them, from what I've heard, didn't even vote because they didn't want to be biased in any sort of way,
Right.
even
That's what I was
avoided voting.
like,
Yeah.
the Cronkite, and like I
Yeah.
remember, like you look at '60s news media reels, and you look at all of these old school guys like Peter Jennings. You don't really know where they stand either way, but you watch news now, and no matter what network you're watching, or whether it's cable news or just regular news, you kind of know where people stand.
By and
And
large, by to a
that's,
certain
I think,
extent. To a certain extent, I think it's more so with like it's a lot easier to spot with certain shows and anchors, right? But just for the rank and file, just regular news shows, I think it's not as easy to sort of discern that. But the point that I was going to try to get to was that when you talk about bias, everyone has them. Everyone has, some form of bias. But I think what goes along with that is if you're biased perhaps about something, you're maybe a bit more informed about the subject because maybe my hypothesis fails there, but just one of my thoughts is that some folks, if given some of their biases, right, their biases, they may be a bit more informed on certain issues that they're passionate about that others are not as informed about. You know what I mean?
right.
So my thing is allow that to not influence your reporting, not to influence your interviewing or your news gathering, but to inform it. Let your
That makes
biases
sense.
inform, your gathering, your reporting, your interviewing. And so, I'm a Christian, right? So I'd like to think that I have a fairly firm theological foundation. I know a little bit about the good book. You know what I mean? So
Mhm.
many would say, well, he's just a biased guy, but I have to sort of constrain that when I'm doing certain stories, maybe involving the church or religion or whatever. But I can still sort of tap into that because I have some knowledge in this area. And let me bring that to bear, not so much the perspective, but the understanding, the knowledge, the nuance, right? The insight, bring it to bear on the story as opposed to overbearing, and unduly influencing a story. And so that's just one thought that I have that I sort of toy with and kind of reframing my mind every now and again, allowing passions and biases and et cetera to inform what you're doing as opposed to influencing it or unduly influencing interviews and reporting and the like.
I love that. I love that answer because in some ways, you know, I sat down with someone and I was wondering, like, okay, well, how do I ask this question without having my bias show? And I think you're right, because sometimes the curiosity that you'll have, in your example, say maybe you are an avid environmentalist, and, you're talking to someone who, kind of claims that global warming is a hoax or something, and you are, just kind of, now I'm curious to know why they would think this way without having it kind of show up in, just, I think, and your advice is to kind of have those biases inform how you go about gathering that story and how you look at it in a way from a perspective of being very curious about why they have that perspective. I think it could be good advice for just us in general, living in the times that we live in, where there is not a lot of objectivity. We are just kind of all or nothing, and I think I was watching some sort of thing on the internet that was just talking about a contingency, going down a historical timeline if the internet had never been invented, and it just kind of came up with this alternate world where print sources like magazines and newspapers were thriving, and you would get your information from reputable sources, and there were no counter sort of, and so it's almost like you're only getting facts from multiple discoursed, researched perspectives, and there's more of that free-flowing sort of researched, debated, and you talk your point, I talk mine, we meet in the middle. And they just kind of talked about the reality of like a 2020, if the internet had never been existed, that's kind of what we would have, and there wouldn't be so much of this deep fakes and informer influencers, and maybe we might have the infotainment guys who are, but I think not even then, because you kind of had this rise of you're getting all your information from so many sources, nobody knows what's real. So I just think that's kind of interesting that you want to have your biases inform your information gathering, and I think everybody should really take that approach to just understanding the situation, especially before we barrel into a Facebook commenting and screaming match.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And even challenging your biases, right? And so if you know that you lean a certain way, and this is not necessarily easy for anyone to do, because you may have certain beliefs or what have you challenged, and you may have to question things. But if you lean a certain way and you have some knowledge there, go and read what people who disagree with you think about. You know what I mean? Just to better even inform what you're passionate about, so that you're coming at it from a very nuanced point of view, in a more informed point of view. And so, but I think the point you made, the example that you gave about like an environmentalist, right? Someone who is just naturally passionate about that, and may perhaps become get into news. They're going to be a bit more informed about that than, say, perhaps the next reporter at the station who just isn't passionate about it, hasn't really read up on it, just unfamiliar with even some of the language and the phraseology and what have you. And so just allowing that stuff to inform you, challenging your biases, right, and your own points of view, to make, and then trying to keep that stuff in the cage. I think that's I think they taught us that in J school. Keep your biases in a cage, so to speak, so that you're not letting it out and tampering and influencing and tainting a story, but just allowing that stuff to inform it. And so.
Okay. Well, thank you. And then my last question, the real question I've been wanting.
Sure.
What are Huel Perkins and Monica Gale like in real life?
You know what, Monica, man, and this is weird. I was kind of saving some of this for whenever Huel retires and we have to do a
He's
toast.
Never retiring. Not
allowed. Huel is just so old school, stately. You know what I mean? And he's an alpha too, so he's like the quintessential old school alpha man. You know what I mean?
Yes. Like, I am the Mr. Newscaster person, and he's been this figure on TV for years. I found some old footage of the Hudson building implosion and Monica Gale, and he is just like the same sort of composure,
dignified.
Yes.
Dignified. and to a certain extent that I don't know how healthy this is, but like I still feel a way just when I'm conversing with them, like I'm talking to Hill Perkins, just because that the respect that I have for him. You
Yeah,
know what I
yeah.
mean?
Mm-hmm.
Just the respect that I have for him. Monica Gale is so down to earth. You know, you see her on TV and you would think she's, you know, so lofty and everything. And she is, right? She's incredibly smart. She's brilliant, a phenomenal writer. Like she's all of that, but she's so down to earth and just so cool. Like, and just the concern that she's ever since I've been here, just shown for me, my family, my kids, and as I've had more kids and everything. She's good people. She's good people. Both of them are. Both of them are good people. And so, yeah,
Because
yeah,
they really have been, staples in,
yes.
kind of the journalism world, and kind of watching, they never miss a beat. They never miss a beat. And
Mm,
I think that's kind of like, I think that's why I wanted to be a reporter when I was a kid, because you're this trusted figure. You come into people's homes each and every night, and, you kind of become the source of, you know, what what information really is, and, what journalistic integrity really means, for especially for communities, because it's local news. And I think in some ways, you're either going to be one of those people who you pay attention to national news or you're not. But everybody at least watches, the local news, and, they get information. And, the internet isn't really going to take that away from folks. And, I just want to say, thank you for everything that you guys do. And, kind of keeping things honest, and telling the stories that are tough to tell. And I could imagine that, maybe the way some stories are told, maybe people would prefer them to be seen in a different light. But I think that's kind of, the whole mission, and is getting it right and getting out there, and, kind of making sure that the right thing is done. So.
indeed. Thank you. Thank you. And thanks for having me. I do appreciate it. This was a very good convo.
Thank you, thank you. I feel like I definitely learned a lot, and I want to continue having, this little web show that I have, grow into something maybe a little bit more, and then grow into something that I think I would like to steadily have people. And I think if it could involve to maybe have more commentary from people and more interacting, and
Mm,
that would definitely be nice to kind of get just more people's take on issues, and empower them. So in the process. So thank you for taking the time to chat with me more about these topics. And yeah, I respect you guys. And I mean, I've been watching you on TV for years, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, Randy Winley. And I think it's just like,
I'm nobody.
I started following you on Instagram, and then I think you
Yeah.
liked one of my pictures. I'm like, oh my gosh. And and then you reached out to me about Quick to Politic, and I'm like, somebody actually watches this. So, but yes, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk, and I hope I could pick your brain in the future,
Yes.
when it comes to connecting and storytelling, and being able to evolve that art.
No doubt. And yeah, yeah. And hats off to you, because what you're doing, as a politician and still looking to inform and engage people to have these good conversations and conversations with folks in the different political ideologies and what have you. And so I think that's dope what you're doing. And so, and I'm wishing and anticipating much success.
Okay. Thank you very much. And last question, and I'm gonna let you go for real.
Sure.
Is Josh Langdon single?
Um, I think he is. I think he is. I don't. Well, I already said I think he is, but I think he is. So I mean, yeah, I believe he is. I don't see him that often because he works in the morning. I work at night.
Right.
So yeah, yeah.
That wasn't a real question, but like,
Yes, it
so thank
was.
you so much for answering either way. All right, I am stopping recording.